Hello, guys.
Hey.
Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Well, thank you for joining us. Before we kick off, I just really want to try and set the scene. I think for the last 10 years plus now, it's no news or surprise to anybody that the third-party cookie has pretty much underpinned the practice of programmatic buying and selling. But if you've been living in a cave for the last 12 months, you're probably aware that the way we transact programmatic advertising today and the way that publishers make money through programmatic advertising and the way brands target their audiences in a programmatic way is kind of being challenged. It's being challenged due to a number of reasons. One of those is privacy, and rightly so. But also it's browsers restricting some of the practices around those third-party cookies. So I'd like to try and spend the next hour or so discussing who is building solutions for life post a third-party cookie, how publishers can continue to thrive and monetize their inventory in the open and ad-funded internet, but also more importantly, what some of the vendors like Google are doing and how they're potentially looking to support the industry. But before we kick off, it'd probably be good if each of you can just briefly give a quick overview of who you are, where you work, and also more importantly, how your company today is harnessing third-party cookies. So Steph, we'll start with you and your very cool pre-bid t-shirt.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Stephanie Laser. I'm the Vice President of Advertising Technology at News Corp. News Corp brands are brands like Wall Street Journal, New York Post, The Times of London, as well as The Sun. And so, we at News Corp, we know that the death of the third-party cookie is coming. One of the things that we're doing right now is we are building up our first-party data asset. So making sure that we can activate on our first-party cookie and making sure that we have good defensible segments that use our first-party data. Thanks.
Perfect. Anand?
Hi, so I'm Arnaud from Criteo, a French company. So I'm from the product team. I've been there for 7 years and I work on the topics of measurement, artificial intelligence, and more recently on identity topics as well. And as for third-party cookies, so they are one of the way we use to be able to retrieve the users of our clients across the web and to do relevant ads that target what they like and what they need. Okay,
great. Thank you. Matt?
Yep. Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Roche. I'm the co-founder and CEO of ID5. ID5 is a young company dedicated to building the next generation of identification for online advertising. So the future identifier post-cookie to support publishers in their monetization efforts.
Great, thank you. There's going to be a lot of people listening that are probably experts on a lot of the topics we're discussing today, but I imagine there'll be quite a few as well that are trying to get their head around lots of the different terminology that we'll be using. Can you just briefly touch upon the main points of difference between a first-party cookie and a third-party cookie? I know it probably seems like a daft question to you guys, but there are many people saying, what does it actually mean? Matt, obviously you guys are building products.
A cookie is a cookie, right? It's just a cookie.
But what does that mean in plain English?
Yeah, I think that the fundamental, the technical difference is that a page is hosted on a web server, right? The web server is basically located on the address that you type. So the sun.co.uk, right, points to a web server. This web server is able to drop a cookie on the browser that is visiting that page, and because it comes from that web server, it will be considered a first-party cookie. Mm-hmm. Upon the buildup of the page, there's a lot of other web servers that are involved that are pulling images or tracking pixels or ads or other things like this. They come from other web servers, right? Those web servers can also drop a cookie on the browser that is visiting the page. But because they are other web servers, like I said, the cookie will be considered a third party, right? And so the main difference is between like what is the server of the page that you're consulting, and this server is the one that you basically have a relationship with as a user, right? You go to the Sun, it's the Sun. You probably go there because you want to, you trust them. You don't necessarily know everything else that happens in the background, and so that's why they've been treated differently by browsers, considering that if we want to simplify, everything that happens in the background is bad from a privacy standpoint. And we can go into more details on this. But that's the basic technical difference, is which web server is delivering the page. And the web server that delivers that page has the right to access the browser in a first-party capacity. And so to write the first-party cookie, which is managed differently by the browsers.
Cool. And Steph, I mean, News Corp, right? One of the biggest media owners in the world, lots of different titles, domains, web properties. I'm assuming the third-party cookie then must be pretty important to you guys when it comes to the understanding of who your users are, how you communicate with them, how you kind of segment them and sell them to advertisers. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. So not only do a ton of the tools that we use, like independent ad tech partners that we work with, use third-party cookies to underpin kind of their identity system, but also we as News Corp use third-party cookies at this point to understand our audiences holistically across all of our different domains. You know, at this point in time, you know, some of the things and proposals that have been going out in the Privacy Sandbox, things like first-party data sets, you know, saying that you can have a first-party data set under, you know, one kind of corporate entity. That's something that we would heavily rely on and support as a proposal today, because we do own all of those different domains. I have noticed that there has been some movement with some publishers to push some of their different properties under one single domain, so that they would then be able to have everything under that single domain, and they would be able to have those cookies all associated and have them all be first-party cookies. But it does pose a challenge for companies like News Corp, like Hearst, like Condé Nast, like any of the big corporate companies that have been typically sharing data across all of their different properties. And I think for right now, a lot of the systems in which we use and kind of the DMP world, a lot of them are based off of third-party cookies. I think there are new systems that are popping up across the ecosystem that help us to activate on first-party cookies, but kind of the legacy DMP landscape that publishers use is mostly based off of third-party cookies.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Thanks for that update, Steph. And I know you guys, right? You're one of the biggest media buy-side platforms in the world, Criteo. You're enormous, and your kind of legacy and the understanding what you guys do has been to re-engage potential customers as they move around the internet. But I'm assuming the majority of that is underpinned by third-party cookies, and that's something you guys are trying to figure out what that world looks like if they're slowly taken away from you guys.
Yes, so indeed, third-party cookies were really, I would say, at the core of what we used to do historically, so what we could call remarketing or retargeting. That being said, more and more solutions appeared to use other ways to continue to retrieve the users of our advertisers, but they still remain a huge asset in what we're doing. So the answer we had to this, and we had that even before starting the discussions around Privacy Sandbox, is really to make sure that we have a way to reach them in a context that makes sense, both from a legal point of view and a user-friendly point of view. And so if you take an example, so on the app world, there is no cookie, right? And we use IDFAs or Google IDs to continue to be able to serve those ads and find ways to also cross that to the web. But to answer your question, this is a topic that has been for the last 7 years. I've been at Criteo, always part of what we are doing, and so that's why we try to enrich our shopper graph with different ways of being able to distinguish the users that are the most valued by our retailers, travel agencies, and classified clients.
Okay, so if my understanding is correct there, what you guys are doing is building a big kind of device graph or a database where you've got privacy compliant identifiers that aren't dependent on the third-party cookie, that still enable you guys to kind of remarket and retarget at scale.
Yes, I won't lie by saying that third-party cookies are still very important in the supply chain. But as time goes by and as everyone is wary of what's going to happen, we are building ways to continue to communicate between publishers and advertisers that are end users as well, that are willing to provide relevant ads across the web.
Perfect.
I think maybe before we go into a bit more of the applications, just back on that differentiation between first party and third party. I think what's really important to understand is that we use third party cookies today as a way to basically individualize a device across the different websites they visit, right? That's why third party cookies have been used historically, right? It's to know that a given browser effectively, because there's rarely anything else than a random code attached to a cookie. A given browser has been on this website and that other website. And there are three main applications that are supported by this ability to identify users across websites. One is obviously using data to target, right? Yeah. So understanding that a user, what Criteo has mastered over the years, right? A user has been on a given page, has shown an interest for something, right? We're going to use that information about their interest to then address them with a targeted message elsewhere. Right. To do that, you need to be able to know that it's the same person or the same device on the two websites. Right. That's number one, targeting. Number two is frequency capping. When you're a brand, super important, right? Because you want to know that a user has already been exposed to your message a number of times across a number of websites. Because at some points, it's like the GRP, reach and frequency strategies that have been mastered by marketers on TV. Apply also to digital advertising. You don't want to overexpose your audience, right? So you need to know how many times you've reached them. Do you want to reach them again, right? So frequency capping is also underpinned by third-party cookies or cross-domain IDs. And the third one is performance measurement, right? For a marketer, performance is I've exposed a certain audience, I've exposed user to my message. What have they done afterwards? Do they go to my store? Do they come to my website? Do they register to my newsletters, right? Again, to do this, you need to be able to bridge the information on where they've been exposed and what they've done, right? And so that also requires cross-domain capability. So those are really the main usage that have been underpinned by third-party cookie, and those are the ones that are at risk.
And are we really only discussing it today at length because of the announcement by Google, Steph? Obviously, again, if people aren't aware, in brief, there was an announcement, recently saying there's going to be a 2-year window for everybody in the ecosystem to figure out what they do before the Google browser Chrome stops supporting third-party cookies. So were cookies fine up until that point, and now everyone's running around in kind of like a mad panic, or have we all kind of known this was always on the cards?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely always known this was on the cards, especially because Safari and all the changes that they've made with ITP over the last few years have sort of disintegrated the way that third-party cookies were used on Safari. Yeah. If you look at most publishers' monetization, they see significantly higher CPMs in programmatic advertising on Chrome, more so than they do typically on Safari.
And that's because sorry to interrupt. That's because that third-party cookie isn't there, right?
Yeah, and I would say that some of the systems that we use bias areas in which third-party cookies exist, to help them with their campaigns, right? So if you layer third-party data onto your campaign and third-party data doesn't exist in Safari, then you're not going to be able to use Safari. That is a piece of what we've been seeing in Safari. So publishers have known for a really long time that this was going to happen. I think buyers are a little bit more just a little bit more behind that because there's so much scale on the internet that it was sort of like as the ITP changes were being made over the course of time, they were just finding the users that they want on Chrome browsers, with Chrome having really a dominant market share in browsers, and with Google also having a significant hand in the advertising ecosystem. I think Google getting rid of third-party cookies is a much bigger deal from a scale perspective, and then also how are we going to solve this? Because I think the industry as a whole wants to make sure that the way that Google is solving it for themselves, that they're also allowing the open internet and independent ad tech third parties to solve it in a way that is the same.
Yeah.
So, as many of us know, there's a lot of antitrust pressures that are going on with Google right now. And so if those two things differentiate, I would believe that it could be seen as an anti-competitive advantage.
Yeah, well, especially if the majority of publishers, right, that don't have paywalls or registration walls are dependent on advertising.
Absolutely.
If their ability, to your earlier point, Steph, around segmenting users, if you've got multiple domains within your portfolio business, is taken away from you, that's going to be really difficult for the free and open internet to really thrive. I mean, from the research that I've been doing pre this call, whenever you look at what brands are saying, it seems to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong here, I know you guys speak to lots of brands, that the focus today still seems to be very much on supply chain transparency, and rightly so, because of the recent ISBA and PwC report. That's thrown up a ton of questions and concerns. But I was really struggling to find anything about ID portability and managing things like reach, frequency, and attribution in their future digital campaigns. Are brands aware of the enormity of what's coming down the pipe?
No, definitely. That's something that we've seen almost every time we presented this topic to our clients, is that they are only grasping the tip of the problematics around the evolution that either are pushed on Safari or on Chrome. And we do see that once we work with them down the path of explaining them all the steps and everything, how everything's going to happen and change, it starts to tick with them, and they understand that it's going to impact them probably more so than they thought it would, especially on the reporting side, actually. There is a huge association with third-party cookies and retargeting, but the proposals that are appearing in the Privacy Sandbox context go far beyond retargeting and have huge implication on reporting that will impact not only performance-oriented advertisers, but also brands and all the funnel, basically. Everyone is going to be impacted, and it's going to change the way everyone is going to be working. Operationally, the way you're going to tune your campaign, adjust your budget, etc. All of this will change.
But I mean, Matt, thank you for that. I mean, Matt, as an identity company, I know you guys spend a lot of time speaking to ad tech and martech vendors, but have you seen an uptick recently of engagement from brands reaching out to you guys to ask what this all means and potentially how it impacts their business in the future?
Yes, we have. We've received the first ever RFI for an identity solution directly from a couple of brands over the past few weeks. So it's a good sign, but I totally agree that it's been by and large a sell-side topic. It's been really a publisher-first conversation for us over the past 3 years. I think, when you look at it from with a cynical eye, it is an existential threat for publishers because that's their monetization engine, right? That's what powers their business model. Brands are already spending a lot of their money on Google and Facebook. They're spending their money across a number of different media channels. So, again, with a very cynical eye, if you lose the ability to do programmatic on the open web, it's just one way that you have to engage with your clients. If you lose the ability to monetize as a publisher through programmatic channels, it is everything that falls apart. And so I think it might explain the differences in approaches. I'm not saying that brands would be happy to depend even more than they are currently on Google and Facebook, but maybe they don't realize the critical element of it. And it's just one part of their investment strategy. So I think there are reasons, but there's also positive, like I was saying, right? Agencies are becoming a lot more involved in the discussion. Brands are starting to kind of and I think where it's interesting is that the industry has taken it as a challenge for targeting, as a third-party data issue, right? I think when you look at it from a brand standpoint, like Arnaud was saying, it's a lot more about performance measurement, reporting, frequency capping, and yes, there is an element of targeting, But I think it's before everything. It's mostly about reporting, performance, ROI measurement, right? That's what really is the main issue for brands, I think.
Well, from what I'm hearing, right, from what you guys are saying, if I understand, the topic properly, I mean, things like attribution have become a real nightmare and headache for brands. They try to figure out which one of their many media partners is actually driving, the sale of their product.
Oh yeah, you're totally blind.
Yeah.
Or you can do econometrics. I mean, it's working offline, right? But this is not why brands are investing on digital advertising.
Yeah.
They're investing on digital advertising because they can measure. If we take that away from them, what's becoming of the digital advertising channels?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, if we go back to the Google solution, I don't think we've touched upon it too much, but they've set that deadline, which we've talked about. But what is their proposal? What have they put out to the market to say, look, we're not going to be supporting third-party cookies. We know that's going to throw up a major challenge for everyone in the ecosystem, like we've already discussed. But what is their Privacy Sandbox? And there's a feature of that referred to as Turtledove that seems to be getting a lot of press at the moment. If that was the de facto solution that everybody had to adopt, what impact would that have on the ecosystem as we know it today, Steph?
All right. So a little bit about the Privacy Sandbox, and I'm going to ask the panel to help fill in some of my gaps because I've done a lot of reading and a lot of talking about Turtledove, but some of the nuances of it have been lost on me a little bit. So the Privacy Sandbox has lots and lots of different proposals in it. Each of them addresses an area of the ecosystem in which Google's trying to make it more privacy friendly. What Turtledove involves is essentially for each bid request, they send out, isn't it two? One ad targeted and one contextual piece of it. Someone else want to pick this up for me?
No, so maybe we can start with the acronym of Turtledove. So it's an acronym actually. Yeah. It's not just a bird. So it means two uncorrelated requests, then locally executed decision on victory. So one might ask if the acronym came first or the expression itself, but I can tell you on Sparrow how we did it, but maybe later. And so as Stephanie said, instead of bidding just one time, you have two opportunities to buy the display. Once solely based on contextual data, and another one based on audience data. And that one, which is I would say the most privacy sensitive one, will be happening asynchronously, right? It's not live anymore. Yeah. So those two requests will be sent ultimately to the browser, and the browser will run the auction and select the ad that will be appearing on the user's screen, basically. So the logic of Turtledove is really to push everything to the browser, from all the ads that are candidates to be seen by the user, right? So not only the one you're actually going to see, but all the candidates, right? So all the clients that want to buy from any News Corp property, they will be downloading their ads and their bidding logic in the browser of the user. And then the user browse the publisher, etc., and the browser will run the auction to decide which is which and which is going to be shown to the user.
Okay. So some of the big holes I've heard in this have to do with how they count like attribution and measurement, basically performance, because it's done after the fact. And a lot of the time, the reason why we use identity for that is because of the fact that we can say, okay, well, this is why this worked. Right? Yeah. This ad worked because of X, Y, and Z, and being able to do that in real time is kind of key to the underpinning of how it functions, like how this functions. Yeah. I think the other piece that is a question is when you start to talk about moving these types of functionality into the browser, there is a succinct conflict of interest that the browser is owned by Google and that most of the ad tech ecosystem is also owned by Google, right? Yeah. And so the question is, do third-party or independent ad tech companies that don't necessarily have a ton of first-party cookies on a user like Google does, and a ton of user data that's associated with those first-party cookies. Are they going to be at a succinct disadvantage in something like Turtledove? And so wouldn't it make a lot more sense if instead of it being the browsers, we had an independent third party that was able to do something like that? Do you want to talk about Sparrow now?
Well, very quickly, guys, this is where I was going to get into, because it sounds like Google have got a solid proposal, and obviously they build good products.
I mean, solid is questionable.
No, but
I'm not sure it's a solid proposal.
What I'm trying to figure out is why some listeners may be saying, well, why are there tons of alternatives? Why is everyone panicking? If Google have put out a plan to say that you can still do data-driven advertising, you can still manage reach, frequency, and attribution using our solution. I think you just touched upon it there, Steph, moving it from the browser to an independent server. I'm just trying to eke out, what are they proposing that other vendors, the independent vendors, have got issues with? Where are some tech players saying, look, what they're doing is good, but we think we can do it better, and we think we can do it in a more open way?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things, right, that can be criticized in those proposals. I think the first one, as you were saying, is kind of a technical one. Google owns the browser, in which the intelligence for segmenting audiences and deciding how to distribute ads and all those things will be hosted, basically, right? So it gives them even more power than they already have on the digital advertising ecosystem, right? I think that the second one is more of a philosophical one. They consider with this that basically any user level data is bad.
Yeah.
Right. They look and they say, okay, privacy is a problem. We're going to strip user level data for everyone, right? And they don't even consider any alternatives, any in betweens, right? There's a lot of things that are not going well today with the infrastructure that we have and third-party cookies because of the nature of third-party cookies, right? There are ways to do things much better, much more privacy compliant, much more secure by removing third-party cookies. We don't have to reinvent the entire system and strip everyone else from access to user-level data. So I think there's a philosophical discrepancy between what they're trying to do and what should be the next logical step. Let's try to fix the problem that we have, which is, that there's not enough control and transparency around the use of user level data, right?
Okay.
And I think that the third point, which is connected to that, which is, quite ironic, is that Google is going forward saying you shouldn't use user level data for privacy reasons, right? To everyone else. What do they do internally? Do you think they're not using user level data anymore on AdWords, on YouTube, on all those things? Really? So they're trying to set a standard for the rest of the world that they're not willing to set for themselves, right? So I think that's a real issue that we should have as an industry, and that maybe regulators should look at, right? They are collecting user level data based on consent, but by removing third-party cookies and by basically preventing, through their sandbox approach, preventing everyone from using third-party user level data, they're basically putting everybody at a major disadvantage. Right? Centralizing intelligence for themselves, removing the ability for everyone else to have that intelligence and to work with it, to differentiate with each other, by saying you shouldn't use user level data, it's bad.
Yeah.
Look at what they do internally, though.
But I think those kind of investigations are underway right now. I think the CMA in the UK is looking at what the implication is for some of these big vendors to have such large market share, but also be dictating the protocols. I kind of understand where you're coming from, and I think those conversations are in play at the moment, right, Steph? I mean, you've been pretty vocal about this on Twitter.
Yeah, thanks. I think the problem is that it's hard enough for people in our industry to get their hands into the Privacy Sandbox and get a good quality understanding of it and what the implications are across the whole of the ecosystem, that I hope that we're able, I hope that the industry, and I hope that even further, regulators, people who don't do this day in, day out, every single day, understand the wider implications of it on the ad tech ecosystem, which I think is a good question, right? While we do these while like all of our different countries are doing investigations on specific antitrust issues, the question is whether or not this comes out in a way that is really beneficial for us in the long run. Because I think there's a very fine line between privacy and antitrust, and Google is leaning hard on privacy right now and trying to say that these are reasons why they're doing it before user privacy, when they have a history of years of antitrust violations over the course of time. So the question really is like how much of this really has to do with privacy and how much of it has to do with antitrust.
No, that's a fair point. And I know you guys at Criteo, right? I read recently that you put out a proposal referred to as Sparrow that is taking some of the Turtledove kind of architecture, but again, trying to make it more open to address some of the concerns that Matt and Steph has raised around portability of data and being a little bit more transparent. Can you just maybe touch upon that so viewers and listeners understand what that is and how that potentially is a solution to Turtledove?
So to the credit of Google, they did start an open discussion on these topics, and I think it gave us the opportunity as an industry to really challenge this old thing that is the cookie, probably older than me, and actually design a solution that is both compliant for the privacy of the user and what he wants to do with it, and also for advertising use case. And for example, IDFA is an alternative in some way as an architecture for the cookie. Coming back to Sparrow, so Sparrow is indeed a proposal in the context of the Privacy Sandbox. So we kept the philosophical principles of Turtledove, the fact that we need to target cohorts, and that there is I would say a barrier, like a Chinese wall between the advertiser world and the publisher world, but try to foster it with the different advertising use cases that we have internally and that we know of, and that cover what Mathieu and Jennifer mentioned. For example, everything around the measurement, either through attribution or A/B testing, delivery limitations, ability to still provide performance through heavy models that is not really possible in the browser. And so we came up with Sparrow, which has three main differences with Turtledove. The first one is the flexibility in the way you can build and stack audiences together, so to provide more intelligence on this component. The second one is the introduction of what we call a gatekeeper, and so it's basically taking the role of this new role that the browser would have and give it to another entity that is not client side but server side, which solves a lot of issue and still act as a Chinese wall.
Okay.
Last but not least is the reporting component, where when Google uses a very strong approach to it by really cornering every potential use cases by using very strong arms, we took all the use cases that we have and we say, okay, what is the minimum that is needed to tackle them? And so ended up with a more relaxed version of the reporting that still complies with privacy. That's the topic that we discuss the most with them right now, and we are going to continue to improve on this. We're going to publish a V2 of Sparrow in 2 weeks. But yeah, that's basically the main differences.
Perfect. No, thank you for that. That's really helpful. Steph, bouncing around on some of my questions here, but prior to the Sparrow overview, you was touching upon the rationale for removing third-party cookies. In your opinion, is privacy. Does that mean that device IDs are done then? Well, they're going to go the same way as third-party cookies?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think I have heard that is a possibility. I think typically Apple is kind of a first mover on things like this, as they have been with kind of the browser market. So I think we'll have to see.
Yeah, because Matt, ID expert on the call, but my understanding, right, cookies, very short shelf life. Most people know how to delete their cookies. They expire naturally, whereas a device ID is persistent. Very few people actually know how to delete or reset their device ID. So if, it just seems strange if somebody says we have to remove cookies because of privacy. For me, it's a logical assumption that the device ID would go the same way.
Yeah, I mean, if privacy was the only reason for browsers removing the access to the third-party cookie, I think we'd be in a very different situation. There's obviously some economical interest behind it, and I think, I mean, when you look at Apple's business, right? It's all on in-app and nothing on the web. So it's not surprising that their decision would be driven by what benefits the in-app world versus the web world, because that's where they make their money. So I'm not saying it's not related to privacy, but if you look at it from a privacy standpoint, privacy doesn't care, like the GDPR, the CCPA, they don't care about cookies or mobile device IDs, right? They care about user data, right? And how are you allowed to collect and to process user data, under what conditions, in what circumstances, right? Whether they're underpinned by a cookie ID, other form of personal identifiers, a mobile ID, whatever, isn't a legal topic, right?
Yeah.
So there's no reason to treat legally the way we are able to identify and collect user data differently, again, from for legal reasons, on mobile apps or on the web. It should be the same thing. The reason that those giant tech companies are treating them differently is because they have different interests.
Yeah.
And I think it's been plain and obvious by the decision for Apple to go after anything related to tracking in Safari and to let the IDFA proliferate, not make them any more visible, not make it any easier to remove them or to to reset them or whatever, because that's where the money is for them. Yeah.
No, it's a fair assumption. I mean, depending on what you read at the moment when it comes to the practice of identity and the headwinds that we face from a cookie perspective, everybody seems to be obsessed with first-party data. Publishers accruing this first-party data. It's going to save the publisher. It's going to save the advertiser. Agencies are obsessed with it. Steph, how again, as one of the biggest media owners in the world, how do you guys go about getting this first-party data? How do you change your practices in 2020 to say, you know what, we need some more of this first-party data?
We just have it. We have it, guys. So the first party data that we have, on our sites, can be anything by what type of articles people are using. You can start to see patterns on if a person comes back every single day and they're reading the same type of content. They're looking at the same stocks every single day on marketwatch.com. They're looking at a significant amount of houses on realtor.com at a same or similar price point over a period of time. You can start to make assumptions about what a user is interested in and what they like. So that is a piece of it. I think the other piece is really getting a 360 view of your user. One of the things we talk about a lot at News Corp is how do we start to think about ourselves more like a direct-to-consumer company where we have multiple touch points with our user at any point in time, and we're able to kind of align that to a succinct user profile so that we understand, okay, this is the type of person that likes to talk to us via email, right? This is the type of person who likes to interact with our content via social, right? And all of those things really concentrating in on our loyal users versus some of the longer tail users that I think for a very long time, publishing has really focused on scale. And the question is, can you really get deeper into your audience to really curate the relationship with them and curate, the content that you deliver to them and an understanding of, exactly what they come to your property for and an interest there. So I think first party data is like way beyond just an advertising perspective. It's hugely valuable from an advertising perspective, but it's also incredibly valuable from an audience development perspective, from a subscription perspective. So, breaking down those walls at an organization, especially that's as large as News Corp, to be able to start to look at our user more holistically has been really fun.
I bet, yeah. And again, there's speculation as to whether or not big publishers now should be putting up some type of registration wall, not necessarily charging their users, but capturing some type of first-party data or building that relationship with their end user. I mean, what are the pros and cons of doing that? Because I'm sure any publisher listening is thinking, Christ, do we need to have a registration wall? Is that going to equip us to segment our audience when we don't have a third-party cookie?
Yeah, definitely. So the issue with so I think the thing that has always kind of plagued publishing is that there's a general nervousness of if you put up something like a registration wall that people will not respond positively to it. I kind of waffle either way sometimes, where I say to myself, when someone downloads an application and they have to put their email address and password in, they just do it. Any of them. It just happens, right? That is something that is like, user, anything that becomes like a user, something that they become used to over a period of time, they'll be fine doing. So in the app world, that's different than the open web world, right? If someone's trying to consume a piece of article that they're lazily consuming on Facebook, they're not going to log in so they can read your article, right? Because they're probably watching TV at the same time and they're doing like a bunch of other stuff, and they don't really care that much to read their article unless it's something they're really, really very, very interested in, and they might consider it. So I actually do think a little bit of that. A little bit of work for a user to get your content might be okay, because then you can start to see how much of your content is bullshit and how much of your content is really wanted by users. But at the same time, we also want to be able to keep the internet open and keep it as not a walled garden. I think that's one of the things that makes the internet interesting and cool and discoverable and shareable and all of that type of stuff. And by creating all of these boundaries in which people can consume content, I think you do walk yourself into an area where there is a chance you're going to lose a lot of eyeballs that you would have had otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the first party data to the logins. I just want to clarify a few things. I think we need to think of data as an asset, right? And so when it's first party data, it's the asset of the party who's building it, right? So for publisher, having access to first party data means they have an asset. The biggest of them is probably Facebook, which has like a huge asset in terms of like customer knowledge and what users do and what they like and stuff like that, right? So building an asset is always a good thing, always, right? And so publishers should obviously harness data, try to understand their customers better. It would always be valuable over time, right? When we talk about identity, we talk about the currency that enables the trading of that data, right? It's really making the link between a buyer and a seller, or between different sellers together, or whatever. It's that connection, right? That's what identity is for. It gives us this common framework so that we can share, we can trade on those assets that buy side and sell side are building on their own with their own customers, right? So those are very different things. Data is not a solution to the trading problem.
Yeah.
Right. Someone like Facebook has data. They don't trade it. They don't share it with anyone. So they don't have a currency problem. So I think it's just to finish on this. The reason why we need a trading mechanism, why we need a currency, is that none of the players in the ecosystem, buyers, sellers, publishers, no one is big enough to compete with Facebook and Google. So the only way for the open web to be an alternative for brands to invest their money versus Google and Facebook is if we can have a common world where we can trade everybody's asset, or we can access everybody's asset in a seamless fashion. And that's why we need this common currency, this ability to trade across a number of publishers, right? So that we can get the scale that otherwise only Facebook and Google can provide us as a brand. And so it's really important to understand those differences. Logins potentially are a great way to accrue data on a user, because when they log in, when they register, they'll tell you, I'm a male, I live there, I do this, blah, blah, blah. But it's also a way to collect a currency, which can be the email address, right? The challenge is this currency scalable enough? And that's a different story. But so I think it's important to really understand the difference between data and identity. Those are very different things.
Yeah, no, that's go on,
I think it's also important to note, something that Matt touched on before about Google having this vast treasure trove of user data, right? publishers are talking about, gathering their own first party data, but what has historically been done for them over the course of the last 10 to 15 years is companies like Google and Facebook have been collecting our data, aggregating it at scale, and using it for their own insights.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we want to ensure when we're moving into a post third party ecosystem is that companies like that are no longer enabled to do that to publishers and then call it their own, right?
Yeah.
Because my data is very valuable in terms of that user at that point in time when they're reading my content, right? But if you are collecting my data and you are collecting Business Insider's data and you are collecting people.com's data and you are collecting every single, piece of internet browsing history, whether it be through the browser, whether it be through search, whether it be through whatever, you're essentially
Login buttons.
Login buttons, everything and every mechanism that they've been doing for the past 10 years. They've essentially been stealing publishers' data, repackaging it and saying, that's Google data, right? And so not only do we need an identity, do we need to make sure that identity from a trading perspective is consistent so that there is no antitrust issue with that. We also need to acknowledge the fact that a lot of this data, which they're claiming is their own data, is our data. It is a publisher's data because we create the content, whether it be on my browser, whether it be on Safari browser, whether it be on Brave, it's still mine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Matt, and to get back to that consistency piece, right, where you said you need that common framework to make sure that ID is portable across all of the independent players, so there aren't any issues with interoperability. If you look at what the IAB recently launched with their initiative in Project Rearc, my understanding there is that they're putting lots of the ID vendors together to try and build that common framework to make sure that there is some consistency. Because at the moment, if you're approaching this subject and you're a publisher or an agency or a brand, there's no escaping the fact that identity is a very complex topic. There are lots of independent vendors that are building for identity solutions. And we spoke earlier about what Criteo are doing in regards to your device graph and trying to populate that with signals that don't rely upon third-party cookies. You have to be a real expert to navigate some of these conversations. So what Project Rearc are doing, my understanding is trying to simplify that process to make sure there is a common protocol and understanding so we can all move forward rather than competing. Is that a fair assumption? Or Steph, can you provide maybe some insights as to what their mission statement is and how you guys get involved in what they're doing?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, Project Rearc. Do you know much about it, how it works? Yeah, it's basically how they streamline in what is a very complex conversation at the moment for many on the buy and sell sides.
Yeah, our organization has been, part of some of the Project Rearc conversations. I think, we will continue to monitor exactly, how they're evolving over the course of time. I believe it will be a piece of the broader, framework of the internet, but I'm not sure that it's going to be everything. So I think we're going to, one of the things we always talk about, our chief data officer talks about it in terms of identity is really identity and how we look at our users is a pyramid. And so you're going to, as you go up the pyramid, you're going to have a more succinct idea of exactly who a user with the top being your logged in user, right? You have a one-to-one match with that person. There's cookies that are involved in that. There's things like Project Rearc. So I think there's a chance that Project Rearc is going to be part of that that pyramid. I don't think it's going to solve everything. So I think, organizations like, I'm right now chairing basically a group in pre-bid who's trying to come up with kind of a technical architecture for pre-bid or a view from pre-bid on, exactly what we, how we want to look at things in that way from a privacy perspective and then also from an identity perspective. So I think there's going to be a lot of organizations having conversations. I think it's going to fit together like a puzzle piece when you have like a bunch of puzzle pieces when we get closer.
Yeah. No, fair enough. And you referenced it's quite interesting. I was going to come on to that pyramid, right, of different levels of identity. Again, depending on what you read at the moment, there seems to be a lot of debate in the industry around the pros and cons of targeting individuals on a one-to-one basis versus cohorts of audiences. some are saying that for programmatic and the practice of data-driven advertising to continue to scale in the face of some of these different privacy regs, we have to slowly move away from one-to-one. But I guess to your point, Steph, if that one-to-one is done in a privacy-compliant way, you have the opt-in. Arnaud, from a Criteo perspective, I guess it becomes a little bit more complex, right? Because your skill set and the technology and the features that you have are underpinned because you're very good at scaling that one-to-one communication. If that goes away and you have to start targeting groups of people, can you still offer the same service? How does that work for somebody like Criteo?
So that's a very good question. So for us, Criteo as a company, I think it just moved the intelligence from one place to the other.
Yeah.
And it really moves it in the way you need to constitute those audiences for them to make sense for the advertising we want to do. So once you build those cohorts, then there comes some questions. So what size those cohorts can be? And this, I would say, impact us indirectly because it still impacts us, but first and foremost impacts our advertisers in different ways. The biggest advertisers won't have issues having like cohorts of at least 1,000 users because they have so many users that even though you are able to put them into those cohorts, you still manage to pinpoint rather precisely what they want to do. So they will still receive the personal ads that they were using. On the contrary, if you look at small retailers, pure players, that just want to bootstrap their businesses with by doing some ads, these guys, if they don't reach the threshold for the cohort, they are completely outside of any advertising capabilities.
Okay.
So that's where I would say the biggest challenge comes from deciding for a threshold, because if you decide, and that's actually where the discussions are right now with Google in the Privacy Sandbox discussions is, okay, cohorts, but how many? 2, 10, 1,000?
Yeah.
And I guess what frightens more the industry is not the idea of doing cohorts, is actually that we still don't know what size these cohorts will be.
Yeah.
And if we want to start building stuff on this, we need to know this to move forward.
I mean, like attribution.
The problem is, I mean, just on this topic, Paul, because I think it's important. The question, I mean, no advertiser wants to reach one person, right? British Airways, McDonald's, BMW, they don't care about one-to-one. They care about millions of users, right? The question is, how do you group the millions?
Yeah.
Where's the intelligence, right? Is it provided to you and they tell you, yep, those are the Coca-Cola zero enthusiast and go deal with it? Or do you let Coca-Cola or Criteo or the Trade Desk or Beeswax or the vendors that are working with the brand that are actually helping them execute, do you let them have their own ways of doing things? And do you let it be a competitive marketplace, right? Because in the end, every brand wants to reach millions of users, right? Or let's say hundreds of thousands of users, right? So it's not about reaching one. It's how do you define that group of users, right? And that's where we need to have the one-to-one capability so that we can build those audiences the way we want as a brand, as a publisher, and not just because we've been told to do so like that by Google. Yeah, I think that's the main difference.
So, and it's maybe a daft question from my side, but how would you manage things like attribution? Some of the major USPs of programmatic technology, and the reason that it gets so much traction and adoption is because of things like scaled attribution insights. How do you do that if you're targeting a group of people? Are there solutions in play for that at the moment, or is that still an open-ended question?
Well, I think for attribution, I mean, for attribution, for targeting, for everything, you need one-to-one capability. Yeah. You need one-to-one identification capability. It's going to be privacy compliant. It's going to be, done under the control of the user. It's going to be a design so that publisher can benefit from the protection of their data that Steph was referring about. Yes, of course, but we need to have this to have the ability to attribute, the ability to frequency cap, the ability to build the audiences we want to reach in the manner that we want to do it, and not just because, again, it's been dictated by someone else that we should attribute that way.
Yeah. So I have a question. All right. So I want to challenge the one-to-one, the notion of one-to-one slightly, only because So I believe part of the reason why like Google and Facebook can charge a significant amount to brands is because of the fact that they have identity, right? And we've kind of handicapped ourselves a little bit with companies like LiveRamp to say to buyers, you can still bring your own data to play, but like here's an email address that can align it, but it still competes with the rest of the advertising ecosystem. So the question is, if you start to create, because the programmatic ecosystem exists off of supply and demand, if you start to actually create a smaller internet of identifiable users, right, that are ones that are logged in with projects like Rearc, whatever, do the rates then go up in that? And then do you use things like cohorts or things like groups, like grouping essentially for the rest of the open internet? So the question is like, does identity become a piece of the pyramid where, yeah, okay, you're going to be able to identify the top of the pyramid, and then naturally, because marketers are going to be competing in that area for a smaller bit of supply than what they have today, which looks like an endless amount of supply, right? Do we then start to talk about two internets, right? Which is, and publishers, it will be true that publishers that have somebody that is logged in or have somebody is a higher rate and they're able to make more money off of that internet. Now, what I don't want to happen in that scenario is for Google and Facebook and everybody who has a first party relationship with the user, for them to be able to do individual one-to-one targeting on everything else. Right? So it's more about everybody playing along the same rules, right? So if we're going to say, okay, the top of this pyramid is identifiable, right? Everybody's got to play by the same rules. But if this part users who, because we don't have a login for them, or we don't have an ID, or we don't have whatever from them, because we don't have like user opt-in and all that kind of stuff like that. Everybody's got to play by the group of rules, but like it can't be an area in which Google is able to identify people on a one-to-one basis, but the rest of us can't.
That's why we shouldn't limit what we call identity to login users. I think that's a big mistake. I think that was probably the initial mistake of Rearc to be too focused on logged in users. Because as you said, right, there are user habits and there are limitations to what you can give in exchange for logins. And so we shouldn't look at this just as logged in users, because logins is going to be 15, 20% at best of the population, right? So we need to build a way to identify users that isn't limited to logins, so that we have as many users that are identifiable with different methods, right? And there are other methods than just using a hashed email address, so that we limit the part that will arguably be less valuable, which is the unidentifiable users. But the goal is to go from 15 to 20 with logins to 80 or 90 with other methods.
Otherwise, Steph, to your example there, we're going to go to an authenticated web to a non-authenticated web, and there's going to be a huge amount of niche publishers, longer tail publishers that are supplying a service to users that are going to be blind to the majority of those on the buy side, because they're not going to have that identity component that you touched upon.
But the buy side then needs to start, like, because if we have another structure there, it's like the value of the high end users. Yes, you're going to have to pay significantly more money for them. But if you're running DR campaigns, or you're running something that is going to that like specifically, like branding doesn't matter, being able to micro target doesn't matter quite as much, maybe that's an area in which you're willing to invest in. So I think it's really talking about the different pieces of the internet, how KPIs can attach to each of them. Because like I think one of the pieces in that kind of long tail is like, what would it look like if publishers use their first party data, came together, could send through, say, certain segments based on, I don't know, IAB taxonomy or something like that, right? And they could send through at scale for the open internet and say, okay, there's 45 different publishers and all of us, have good quality first party data segments. We're not going to push you through this particular like ID, but we're going to let you know who that user is. And that might actually be okay for some marketers who are looking to spread awareness.
100%. That'd be a great idea.
As long as you can figure out a way in which to signal to them frequency capping, like in which to signel. So you like targeting.
This is targeting.
Yeah.
So what about capping attribution?
For frequency capping, you could probably I'm sure we could figure out some sort of federated way in which to like maybe use a technology like Previt, for example, to be able to signal to somebody, okay, this is the third time that you've seen this user in a more privacy compliant way.
Am I right in understanding that Sandbox won't allow you to do that at the moment? It won't allow multiple domains that aren't owned by the same company to come together and execute that example, Steph?
Yeah. So I mean, I think frequency capping is a big question right now. Because even if we can figure out some of the stuff for targeting, like frequency capping is incredibly important to buyers. And so even if it means that we don't give them an ID, we need to at least be able to give them a signal. And in order for us to give them a signal, somebody has to, there's got to be a part of the ecosystem somewhere that's managing that.
Yeah. So I think you're on mute, Arnold.
Sorry, guys, that was to avoid my kids crying in the next room. So yeah, about frequency capping, I think it's very important because it relates to all these initiatives around privacy. But and it's very important for buyers to indeed control the frequency capping. But if you think about it, it's important also for the user, right? The user don't want to see the same ads all the time. They want to have some degree of variety, at least in what they see. And if we think about the consequences of everything that is proposed here, it means that probably decreased CPM, so probably more inventory and more displays to the user, right? So they will see even more pervasive ads everywhere on their screen. And a repetition of these ads, granted maybe on shared domains, there will be an ability to say, okay, only 3 ads for this guy on this domain, but the next minute he goes on another website, then again the same ads, etc. And so that's very important that we give the opportunity for the buyer to say how much display they want to do to a user on a specific period, but it's also very important for the user. And so since the whole privacy topic is put in a user-centric approach, right? We want to do this because it's right for the user. We should also think about how it's going to affect his whole browsing experience, right? And so even though it might feel more private in the backend, actually there will still be some personalization, and the frequency capping is going to be impacted, so probably more ads. And since you cannot measure the performance, it might degrade, so the ads won't be as relevant as before, etc., etc. So it's important to have a full understanding on how the whole browsing experience is going to be affected by this.
Okay, perfect. And as we slowly start to wrap up the conversation, Matt, I know you guys speak to lots of the big agencies, and there's probably going to be a lot of brands watching or are watching. What types of things should brands be asking their agencies if they're trying to better understand what a lot of this kind of jargon means, and if they're worried about things like attribution in 12 to 24 months?
Well, like you said, right, this is a specialist's conversation that has ramification for everyone, right? And so the difficulty is how do you get involved in the conversation, and we need brands to be involved in the conversation because they are going to vote with their dollars. And so it's important to get involved. It's important to ask questions. It's important to listen to webinars like this, because it is still a specialist issue. It is still a technical issue, but it's very important for everyone to understand the stakes, because again, we're talking about an existential threat for a lot of publishers.
Yeah,
and we're talking about a risk of huge, even greater dependency from a very small amount of platforms for brands to be able to interact with their audiences. So it's not just a technician, it's not just a plumber problem, right? It is everybody's problem if we cannot maintain a healthy, ad-supported open web in the future. Publishers need to pay the journalists. God knows we see that every day these days. It's important to have a free press, to have journalists, right? This is paid for by advertising. If we kill advertising by making it useless for brands to invest on the open web, we're creating a lot more problems than just privacy. Privacy is a problem. We can address it, but we need to address it in a way that helps, that enables us to maintain the ad-supported ecosystem that is financing media today.
Yeah, perfect. And Steph, 20 publishers watching that are terrified about losing their advertising revenue and trying to navigate this complex space. Who should they be speaking to internally? What types of questions should they be asking? And how do they start to get under the skin of this complex topic?
Yeah, totally. So I don't think that you can just stay in your own organization and talk about this. I think it's really important for you to get outside and to join groups and to do your reading. So I think one of the things that's, there are resources that are available online about the Privacy Sandbox, about the future of third-party cookies. I think definitely take a look at those, get a good reading and a good understanding. And one of the things I've always loved about this industry since I got into it 10 years ago is the fact that everybody shares with each other and everybody talks about, what they're doing, what they like, all that kind of stuff. And there are massive amounts of publisher groups where we're talking about our different strategies, things like that. Obviously, not sharing anything that is business sensitive information, but sharing things like, how we're looking at the future of advertising. And I think that engaging in those conversations and being part of the decisions that are being made for the future of third-party advertising is very important. You can join my group in Previd. Well, a little bit of a pitch there. If you join Previd, you can join my group, and we can be here to kind of help to figure out what the future is. And none of these solutions have to be a single solution, right? Like I said before, there is a pyramid aspect to this, and we have to kind of consider, like, how are we going to segment the internet into one that's privacy safe, but also one that helps us to deliver out the best value for users. Because as Matt said before, like, journalism is important and content is important. And one of the biggest ways that we continue to fund the work that we do at news publications is through advertising. So we have to figure out something that makes it work for brands.
Totally, completely agree. And Arnold, I mean, again, you guys speak to lots of brands direct on a daily basis. Any brands watching now, what would you recommend they be doing internally? Who do they need to be, who do they need to be speaking to?
So they can come to us. No, but more seriously, and I will go to what you guys were saying just a few minutes ago. I think it's very important that you do your reading, you read the proposals. Lots of things are public. Granted, it's a bit hidden, but everything is public. And so I think the first step is really to engage with this documentation and try to go to the bottom of things. And it's also public. So it's not only reading, you can also participate and asking questions. Yeah. And I think it's very important that even if they don't feel they have the right level, because it's, as Matthew said, it's very technical, it's very browser engineering oriented in the way it's formulated. Yeah. Actually, there are some very high concepts that any marketer can resonate with. Attribution is a good example. And so these are the topics they need to engage with it and ask questions and raise their issue, because this is a consultation, right? And so it's important that everyone participate to this. We try to do our best to represent the interest of our clients. But even if these guys could participate themselves, that would be, I would say, that give even more weight to the arguments we are trying to bring to the table.
Perfect.
And in the end, manage to find a solution that everyone will be happy to work with, that will result in continuous spend on the open web, and so performance for advertisers and spend for the publishers. So
excellent, thanks for that. And lastly, if you could click your fingers and change one thing in the identity space at the moment, what would it be? Anything, Matt?
Massive adoption by all publishers and ad tech vendors of the shared identity solutions, like that.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's a fair and credible wish. Steph?
I'd like to kill third-party data.
Yeah. It's going away anyway, though, right? It's not going to be around for much longer.
But I hate it a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what about
I think some of my fear is that if we create too many overarching identity solutions, that we recreate third-party data, and third-party data is garbage.
Yeah, nice, fair point. Arnaud?
So I would fast forward in 2 years to see where the hell we are going to be.
and just copy that and implement.
Yeah, right?
Exactly.
Just a time machine. Just a sneak peek.
More seriously, I think I would I would try to really find a way to, and it plays to what we had today. I would really try to have everyone aware of what's going to happen for really having this informed decision making happening. Because so far it's a very few people are aware of what's happening, and those that are going to be impacted are still left out of the discussions in the majority of it.
Yeah.
And so that would be my wishful thinking, is having everyone on board in this, truly on board.
Brands and agents. I would like brands and agencies to be a little bit more involved in the conversation, because the last thing I want is for more money to be shifted in the advertising ecosystem into walled gardens because of us not being able, us as an ad tech and publishing ecosystem, us not being able to meet needs that we could easily solve if we all align.
Yeah, completely agree. Well, listen, guys, really appreciate your time. Really informative discussion. I think it's safe to say that there are a ton of really good solutions out there trying to ensure that the open internet continues to thrive and publishers can make money, paid journalists, brands can continue to advertise at scale. And, all of the money doesn't end up going to one or two vendors. So thank you again. And hopefully catch up soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.